Hi YouTube world, welcome back to my channel. If it's your first time here, welcome. I am Adrienne, I live in New York City, and I love playing with makeup. I also collect makeup, and occasionally I need to declutter. Actually, this is a declutter that has been 20 weeks in the making. I decluttered a lot of my eyeshadow palettes about 8 months ago, and since then I have been doing a weekly Shop My Stash, which I call my week in makeup, where I force myself to refamiliarize myself with makeup and maybe neglected makeup and understand why I'm using something or not using something. And so within these last 20 weeks, I really have been using a lot of my eyeshadow palettes. And in doing so, I have made some really tough decisions. And so I start off this declutter with over 150 palettes, and I declutter over half of them, which is staggering. I wanted to jump on quickly though to just level set with some basic information, and then you all can enjoy the declutter. First off, I have very oily eyelids, and my preferred eyeshadow primers are Smashbox Photo Intensify as well as the Lorac primer. I mention this because maybe you're gonna see a formula that I talk about that doesn't really work for me, and it really works for you. So if you have drier eyelids or normal eyelids, I am certain a lot of these eyeshadows that I am decluttering are going to be perfectly fine for you. Or sometimes it's a color story that just doesn't inspire me. I wanted to show you very quickly my singles collection. I have an extensive singles collection. This is just my Sydney Grace singles by color. So you see I have blues, purples, warm tone shades, mauvey pinks, and sort of like my neutrals. So this is just my Sydney Grace kind of library. I also have miscellaneous palettes that contain Colourpop, Anastasia, some other brands like Divina and Colored Rain. My most prized possession are some of my favorite shades from JD Glow and Cleonad. I highlight this because some of the decisions I make is because I'm taking these shades into account. If I'm going to be using a special shade, I don't want to retain a 12-pan palette for that shade if I have the shade already in one of these beautiful formulations. I just want to make that clear because I do not arbitrarily declutter. I am really thoughtful. This channel is not sponsored by anyone, just my own bank account. And so it matters to me what comes into my house and how it leaves my house. And so I treat my things like gold, like gold. And I also want to show you sort of a swatchathon that I had as I was making some of these decisions. If I saw there were just a lot of color stories that were repeating themselves, I kind of did a face-off of those colors. Lastly, where do these shadows go after I declutter them? Well, a couple of things happen. First, I clean all my eyeshadow palettes and I disinfect them with Menagerie Cosmetics sanitation spray. This is industrial grade. This is what a lot of professional makeup artists use for their kits to sanitize powder products. So I clean and sanitize everything. Then it's gonna go into 4 different slots. One, it's gonna go on my Poshmark account, where I have a very healthy amount of listings, and this is how I sort of recycle things in and out of my life. Poshmark. So if you're in the States, definitely check out my Poshmark. I will put my closet information down below. Secondly, friends and family. I also think about donation. Where I can, I would prefer to donate items to those in need. And lastly, if something is in really bad shape or has just been heavily used, I toss it. And I have to say, I almost never get to a point with my eyeshadows where that happens. Unless some disaster occurs, I usually don't toss it. So I wanted to let you know those ground rules before we dive in. I tried to organize this video as best as possible, where I do brands and then maybe themes like drugstore or indie. So something to kind of get you a little organized, and so that I could talk about formulations in a bit more depth. So I really hope that you enjoy this declutter, and without further ado, let's get started. Here are just some of the Natasha Denona palettes I have. I actually really like these two large ones. This one's pigmentation is excellent. I got this in a BoxyCharm, and I wasn't even a BoxyCharm person for a long time, but this is the peak. I think all of these colors though are found in other palettes of hers, but I just think the formula is really, really nice here. It's super pigmented, and I am definitely keeping this one. I am also keeping this one here, the Ayana palette, for the same reason, and it's sort of an unusual color story in that depending on the shimmer shades you use, the look can be very different. This one here, I don't have anything like this, but I am not a black and white gray kind of person, and I have these tones in so many other palettes. So if I'm seeking out a silver, I'm not gonna go for this silver necessarily. And I have other grays and blacks, so I don't think I've even really used this more than once, and so I'm just gonna go ahead and part with it. This one as well, I meant to declutter this last time, but what I really like about this is this kind of muddy green, and I have plenty of Colourpop palettes that give me this. This is the only mini I'm actually keeping. This is the mini Zendo palette. There's something about these tones that I really love. They're very flattering, and I love this kind of burnt plum color, brownie plum color, and just the combination in general is very, very unique. So this is actually my latest acquisition of Natasha Denona. I picked this up on Poshmark. Someone was selling a brand new one. It is the Safari palette. I haven't had a chance to really play with it, so I'm gonna keep it. I'm going to make sure I start to play with it. These also are some of my favorites. The Natasha Denona Biba palette. I actually played around with this one a lot at my sister's. I had gifted it to her for Christmas one year, and I really love this palette, so I found myself wanting it, so I purchased it, and I really like it as like a basic neutral palette, but it just has some more level of depth to it that I really just can't explain. It's the Lila palette. I wasn't that impressed with a lot of the colors. The only color that really gets me is this one here, which is like a plumbed red color, but I know that I have this in some other palettes, and I'm not gonna keep this palette just for this color. The bronze palette, this is just too much of the same color. I swatched this, and I also swatched some other shades from some other Natasha Denona palettes I have, including the Metropolis palette. And I realized I can get the bronzy look I want out of the bronze palette. I can actually get it out of Metropolis. Metropolis is a very useful palette. I know it's a lot of shades, but I do think it's wonderful. I also can get a really pretty bronzy look out of the Zendo palette, which I really love this palette. This might be for some people a very confused palette, but I like the variety here, and I've created some really beautiful looks from this, so I'm happy to have this. So definitely keeping Zendo, definitely keeping Metropolis, but parting with bronze. Here are more minis. I am going to be parting with Lila. The purples here are very patchy, this mini Lila. This one here, that's the mini pastel. I hardly use this, but I realized that I have a few palettes that have these colors that I'm keeping, and so I don't really need this palette. Bronze, same situation with this one, and actually this one I don't like that there's just one shimmer here, and that these tones are a little too close once you put them on the eyes. I wish there was more contrast here. I would have kept this otherwise. And then this is one of the large size palettes, Jubilee, also from BoxyCharm. It's just very disjointed for me, and the colors that I really love in this, they don't perform as well. This is the Trio Chrome palette. I love this palette. I have to play with this so much. What I really love, more than just that it has these 3 special shades in the middle, I just love the color story. It's very, very wearable, and I don't know that they marketed this as well as they could have, but I really love this color story. I think this is one of my favorite palettes. I can't wait to use it more. This one I've hardly touched, but I want to play with it. I'm not ready to part with it. This is the Retro Glam palette. Sunset palette is one of those. This color story, ultimately, once I looked at my whole collection, I have this color story and there's just a lot of duplication in this palette, so I'm not gonna get the best use out of it, so I'm willing to part with it. This one too, the Circle Local palette, although I love the packaging, the colors are so beautiful. I think someone with a deeper skin tone would have so much fun with this. On me, this is just too much color and not enough balance in a palette. The Sunrise palette, I haven't used this enough. I want to. This one is the Pastel palette. I'm going to part with this. Again, not enough color variety for me, and there are a couple of pastel palettes that I have that I really already am sort of attached to, and if I'm gonna think of a pastel look for myself, I'm gonna go to those palettes first. Here are some other mini palettes of Natasha Denona's that I'm parting with. A lot of these are so similar, and honestly, I have these shades in a Lorac formula minis that I prefer. This is the Mini Glam, the Mini Nude, the Mini Biba. This one here, I have discovered that I actually have shadows of these colors in my Sydney Grace collection, so I'm fine parting with that. And this one is, you know, I meant to part with this the first time that I decluttered shadows and I didn't. This one just has a little bit of some disjointedness when it comes to tones for me. And so for that reason, I'm parting with all of these minis. The gold palette, I recently used this. I was very unimpressed with it. All the looks that I got out of this seem very similar, and some shadows just were very inconsistent. I actually much prefer the Metropolis palette to get similar looks, so that's how I got away from this one. And then this is the mini gold palette, which is very pretty, but I have these shades in other palettes that I prefer, mainly Colourpop. And these palettes all I am actually keeping. I will show you the retro palette. I haven't used this enough, but want to. This one also, the Natasha Denona My Dream palette. These seem very similar, so maybe down the road I prefer one over another, but just for right now, I'm not willing to part with either. The Glam palette, I have not dedicated enough time to. I'm not a cool tone person, but I feel like there's some really pretty looks to be had here, so maybe this will work out for me. And this one I have spent a lot of time with. This is the Love palette. There are some really beautiful looks that I can create out of this, and I feel like this is absolutely a more unique color story for her. Now we're moving on to Moira. I am not decluttering either of these. I have two palettes of Moira's. I really enjoy their formula. The formula I'm most familiar with is this one, Time to Shine, in the greens. Packaging is super annoying and bulky, but I love this color story, and I had so much fun the week I played with this, so I definitely want to play with it more. I loved it so much, I went onto their site and I picked up this palette, which I feel has like a very unusual color story. A lot of that Mini Tropic palette can be found here, so it's one of the reasons why I'm very excited to use it. Love their formulation, can't wait to pull this out in the coming weeks and play with it. I hope it's as good as this one. Another brand, I love their formulation. As you saw at the top of this video, I have an extensive collection of singles. I love the Mel Thompson Tiny Marbles palette. It's going nowhere. Very unique color story. This is the Enduring Love palette in the original packaging. I love this as well. Even though the tones look like they're very similar, they actually are very different. And the foiledness of the shadows are gorgeous. So I definitely want to be playing with these more. And this one is by Tentalia in conjunction with Sydney Grace. This is the On the Horizon Light palette. This I recently played with, and although the color story is really pretty, I keep forgetting that I have it. I keep forgetting that this color story exists, and for that reason, I just know I'm going to keep forgetting about it, and so I rather just declutter it. Probably my next biggest grouping is actually Colourpop. I really generally love Colourpop's formula. I love how affordable the brand is. I really enjoy the color stories and the concepts they come out with. Not all of them, but some of them. And some of them really surprise me. Some of them also surprise me in a not so great way. For example, this palette I thought I was going to adore. This is the Aurora Struck palette. I'm not the biggest fan of large size palettes, but this one, for whatever reason, it never spoke to me. And the few eye looks that I did, I just didn't love. So I'm not falling in love with it. Why am I going to force myself to keep it just because I love packaging? Conversely, one of the large size palettes that I really love, which is very weird for me because I'm not like the biggest fan of neutrals, but I love this one, Getting Fresh. This one has some really pretty shimmers in it. I love the pops of green. I love the peaches. This is just one of my favorite palettes. And this is one that I had so much fun with, working all week with, and you can create some really beautiful different looks out of it. This is sort of in lieu of that Love palette by Natasha Denona. I really love this one. So this is the Wine and Only palette. This one too, I created such beautiful pastel ethereal looks with. This is the Shell Shocked palette. I really did like this one, and I had a lot of fun creating looks, so I'm definitely keeping those. This one I never fell in love with. This is the Plush Like Me. I heard lots of good things about it, but then when I got it, I just thought it was really ordinary. This one I had initially decluttered, but I'm keeping around because I think it's a lot of fun, this color story, and I have had fun with the formulation, so I just have to give this more chances. This is In the Springs. This one here, although it performed really well, this is the Violet Quad. I have this in a few other palettes, and so I don't need to keep this. I am not a Star Wars person, but apparently I am when it comes to Colourpop. This is the Mandalorian palette. This is the Child palette. And this is the C3PO palette, this gold. Such a beautiful gold palette. I love this one, and I haven't familiarized myself enough with this one, but I don't want to part with it. These are also fairly new. Glow Getter, which kind of reminds me of this one off Melrose. Has a lot of similarities, and I like that this one doesn't have a pressed glitter, so I'm going to part with Off Melrose. Sage the Day is very green, very similar to the Child palette, but a little bit deeper, and I'm not ready to part with it, so I'm going to keep it around. California Love, I thought I was going to really love this, and I just couldn't. I could not fall in love with it the way that I thought I would. And so for that reason, I'm just gonna let it go. The Troublemaker palette, I spent a really good week with this palette, and I learned so much about it. I think initially the color story attracted me, but I wasn't over the moon. But as I used this palette, I really fell in love with it. This one is so much fun. This is one of these fun, colorful palettes. This was a very surprising color story. It's the Muppets. I love the Muppets. But I also love some of the shades that are found here. And you can create some really beautiful looks out of this that are very kind of day appropriate, but you can also go really fun with it. Yeah, I'm very excited to play with this more. This is, though, not a holiday palette in my book. This is much more spring, summer. This is Glaminatrix. I have 3 palettes of theirs. Let's start with the winning palette in my book. This is the You Beauty palette. I just finished a week of using this. These are extraordinary foiled multi-chrome shadows with beautiful mattes that blend really well. Great inspired color stories, so super excited to keep this around. Separately, the Nearly Neutral, although very pretty, and I'm sure someone's gonna adore it. For me, it's the performance is not what it should be with the mattes, and these shimmers are just all a little too similar, and I have so many beautiful shimmers. I just prefer to hand this on over to someone who is really excited to get an Australian indie brand in their lives. Same thing with the Nocturnal palette. This color story is gorgeous, gorgeous. This is a very fragile palette though, and I actually have shadow palettes that have very much of the same story that I'm more excited about the formulation. This is Adept Cosmetics. I initially was this is the Amulet New and La Cienega. Amulet New, I used only a couple of times. I like this scrunchie color story, but I find that their shimmer formulas, these in particular, are very, very chunky, a little too chunky and oily for me. And I don't know. I'm just not as excited about them as a brand and as color story. And then I pre-ordered this one, which seems just completely disjointed to me. I feel very uninspired by it. I barely touched it. I just, this was a purchase regret. I have two Give Me Glow palettes. I have Christmas Morning, which I love so much. This is like one of the easiest palettes to use in terms of creating distinct looks. It's just so pretty. I am also keeping Pastel Dreams, which is probably my favorite pastel palette ever. It's, again, really easy to follow along, really easy to create looks, and just so aesthetically pleasing. Here are some color palettes that, although I love the color story, the formulation just really doesn't work for me. Sigma, the Enchanted palette, so pretty. Unique soft color story. I love how they chose these darker mattes to complement the looks. The shimmer formula is very thin, and so if you are someone who likes a lighter look, you might really like the Sigma formula. Just on me, it doesn't seem to last as long as it should, and so for that reason I'm letting it go. And then this is one of their 9-pan palettes. This is the Ivy palette. I had to repress this one, but as much as I love the color story, same problem. It just doesn't really work that well with my chemistry. The Glamlight formula, again, love this Michaela Pat 2 palette. Love the color story and everything, but these shadows are difficult for me to blend for whatever reason, and the shimmers are not as impactful as I want them to be. And then I also picked up this one because it's a lot of fun. This is the Chucky palette, but honestly, this is just so dark, and I am not this person. Maybe I was this person when I was, you know, in my Pesh Mode Cure phase, but I'm not this person anymore, and I don't trust that the formulation is going to work with me. Here's a random indie sort of mashup. This is by Menagerie Cosmetics. I hardly touch this one. This is the Sugar High palette. This is such gorgeous mattes and color story. I just know I'm not going to use this. It's a little too vibrant, doesn't have enough contrast for me, and yeah, I gotta be honest with myself. Just because I like the aesthetics of something doesn't mean that it's right for me and my collection. This color story, as much as I really like it, this is from Cosmic Brushes. I believe the Serenity palette. This got a lot of hype. I like this color story. It's very interesting, but the few looks that I did, they just didn't blend out properly for me at all. And if I'm going to pick a palette that's sort of similar to that, I really love the Kaleidos Club Nebula palette. And this one has just more depth, more variety for me, but also is kind of like conceptually easier for me to follow. And I love the looks I've created with this. Since we touched on Club Nebula from Kaleidos, this is the other Angelica Nyquist collab. This is with Odin's Eye. This palette for me, I just didn't love the looks I created. I didn't even really love the formulation too much. Yeah, this is sort of lost on me. And kind of how I use makeup. Here's a brand that is no longer. This is Kylov. They went out of business recently, but I love their color stories. I just thought their formula was okay. This is the Van Gogh and Honoré palette. This is the Van Gogh. Really pretty color story. It's much more subtle than you think by looking at it. Like, oh, it's not as like in your face. This one's really pretty and soft, the Honoré palette. So I just think someone else would really enjoy these. These palettes by What's Up Beauty, really nice formulation. This is the Geodes palette, and this is the Monsoon palette. Of the two, I like the Monsoon palette more simply because I like the depth of the color story. So I'm gonna let go of the Geodes palette, but I find there's a bit more variety in the Monsoon palette for me, but very pretty. I love how slim they are. They're perfect travel palettes. Here are some palettes by Nomad. I've had a some mixed luck with Nomad. I actually haven't touched the Whistler Lodge palette yet. It's still brand new. So I'm looking forward to playing with this one. I do like the color story. So this one is a keeper for now. I loved the Hudson Valley palette. I had such a good time working with this. I created such pretty looks, and I just love the color story and concept, so I'm also keeping this one. This one fell a little short for me. This is the Fête de Provence. So I used this for a week and I just did not love the looks that I came up with, and the formulation was just okay for me. So not all are created equal. These are all no's as well. This is Violet Voss Olive You Forever. I love the concept of the color story and everything, but I don't like Violet Voss's formula. I've tried it a few times, never have really liked it. Shroud Cosmetics Arcana. This is such a cool moody palette, but similar to that Kylov formula, it isn't as pop as I would want it to be. Like there's a lack of vividness for me. This is by September Rose. This is the Still Pretty palette. Such a beautiful packaging and color story, but this is just way too vivid for me. So I didn't even swatch a lot of these colors because I just feel like this is for someone who's really looking for a hot pink red type of look. But yeah, I had always heard very good things about September Rose, so I can't really speak to it. It's just not a color story for me. And then this one from It's Belle Cosmetics, Break the Rules. This was like one of the hardest palettes to get. This is an all shimmer palette, and the shimmers are really gorgeous. There is nothing wrong with this palette. This is a fantastic topper palette. It's just that you saw I have too many shimmer toppers that I have spent way too much money on, and I shouldn't be keeping palettes like this for the same purpose when I have Cleonid shadows. Let's do some drugstore palettes. So these are by Flower Beauty. I'm sure you've heard this before, but these are excellent. This, similar to the It's Belle, is a very sort of topper formula. It's very creamy. It's really just about the color story, which color story you prefer. This is Jungle Lights. This is Desert Lights. I hope they come out with another one that is completely kind of off the rockers. I would just love to see something else, but I do think this formulation is really great and such a creamy, wonderful blingy formula. So that is Flower Beauty, definitely keeping those. This is Juvia's Place. I have a mini, the taupes. I used to love this, but as I swatched it this time around and played around with some other palettes that I have, like the Natasha Denona Glam Retro, I feel like I can create this now. So I'm gonna part with this one. But this one, the Magic Mini, this is an excellent palette. I know this seems like very vivid, kind of crazy, but I spent a whole week creating looks out of this, and there's some beautiful shadows here, and actually quite approachable even if you have a light skin tone. So I highly recommend this one, and I am keeping it. This one by Essence, Don't Stop Believing Mini Eyeshadow Palette. This wasn't any good. I was just curious about the formulation, and yeah, I did not like this at all. Another one I didn't care for were these Bite Size by e.l.f., but these, the Good Vibes Only. I have used the Bite Size formula before and actually thought it was pretty good. This one, for whatever reason, just wasn't that great. Even though I really liked the color stories, the formulation was just off. It wasn't as good as the other mini Bite Size palettes that I've tried. One of my favorite brands for drugstore formulation is J-Cat, and I don't have a lot because it's like one of those things you can easily collect too much, but this is the Dia and Noche palette. I've had this one the longest. I love this. I love how foiled these shadows are, how pretty the kind of gradient color story. It's just such a perfect palette, and I recently saw that they had released these, which is the Chaotic Element 21 color palettes. I picked up the Jungle Roar. This one is extraordinary. It's so beautiful. I love the greens. I love the peaches. I love the pops of yellow. I had a lot of fun creating looks with this, and I want to continue to create looks with it. This one here, this is actually pretty good. This is the NYX Ultimate Utopia. There are a lot of shadows in here. There are a lot of looks. I'm just a bit overwhelmed by it all. It performs very well. I didn't have really any major complaints. It just kind of gets lost in my collection, and there are formulas I much prefer over this. BH Cosmetics, I know so many people love BH Cosmetics. On me though, the formula doesn't last. But the only exception to that has been this shadow palette. This is the Do Not Disturb palette. So I am keeping this one, but I'm actually going to part with all of these. I will show you their color stories. They're all very pretty. And this is Los Angeles. This is Paris, Avocado Toast, Switzerland, Mimosa, and Blueberry Muffin, one of my favorites. Although these are very pretty, it just doesn't last on my eyelids. So here's my Tarte collection. I'm actually gonna let go of all of these. One of the reasons why I don't love their eyeshadows is I just find, even though they smell delicious, they're like a vanilla scent. Some of their metallics are a little too flaky for me, or they just don't stick as well as I want them to. Even just the regular kind of shimmer or kind of creamy shimmer formulas. And their mattes are much darker on the eye than when you see them in the palette. So I'm always very confused about what kind of look I'll be getting with it. And then there's also color stories, but let me walk you through them. This is the Tarte Spark palette. This is the Tartelette Party, Tartelette Tease. And this is the Tartelette Jewel. And then we have their holiday releases. It's the Gilded palette, and this was the Gilded palette, more warm tone for the holidays. And then this is the Glamour palette, which is more cool toned. Then we have their iconic, one of my favorite packagings ever. This is the Clay Play palette. This was an all over face palette, but this isn't me. This is a little too plain for me. I need a little more variety. And this is the Tarte Maneater palette, which I never really got behind for whatever reason. Although I love the imprints and color story is really interesting, I just didn't love it. Here is an indie brand that I am very excited to explore more, though I have not used it as much as I want to. This is Blend Bunny Cosmetics. This is the All Done Up. I love this color story, really have enjoyed the formulation, need to play with it more, definitely keeping. This one I haven't touched yet. This is a rainbow palette. I don't have a rainbow palette in my collection, and so that's why I picked this up. Just thought it was very utilitarian. It's an all matte rainbow palette. So I want to keep this out kind of close to where my singles are, so I remember to use it if I want just a little pop of a certain color when I'm working. This was sort of the first palette of theirs that I fell in love with. Really love the formula here, very soft tones. This is a really great brand if you haven't discovered them yet. I highly recommend it. Great value too, and I've had a really good shopping experience on their site. This is the Jaclyn Hill Morphe palette, volume 2. I just never really loved this. The few looks I created were perfectly fine, but I'm not gonna remember I have this, and I feel like this would be better off in someone else's hands. Here are some more mainstream palettes. This is from Nars. This is the Voyeur Hibiscus. I did not love this shadow look on me, so I'm gonna go ahead and declutter this. I do really love this one. This is the Climax palette. It's a great travel palette. And I also really loved the Claudette palette. This one here is really pretty, kind of easy to follow along. Two more that I'm keeping. Too Faced Sweet Peach. Boy, did I use this the other day. I was so happy with my look. I know it's basic. I know it's not the best formula, but there's something that this palette has. This is sort of one of my first gateway products into falling in love with makeup and its playfulness. This is it. So I have a lot of affection for this. So this is going nowhere. Similarly, this Dose of Colors Donald Duck collab. I love this. My dad's favorite character was Donald Duck, so you'll find Donald Duck all over my house. And I picked this up when he was very sick, and soon thereafter actually passed. And so this has just a special place for my heart. But I have to say, I've never really used a lot of dose of colors, and the formula here is really good. And so I have to use this more, but I will probably keep this forever. Really reflected on this and realized I shouldn't have picked this up. This is maybe for someone who is a minimalist in makeup. I am not that person. This is the Photo Edit Eyeshadow Trio in Nudie Pick Light. This is like a great, easy on the go, can be used even for the brows and as a liner. But on me, I'm just not gonna remember I have it, so I'm gonna let it go. Here is my Huda collection. So I really love all three of these and can't wait to use them more. I recently dedicated a week to rose quartz and I was so impressed by it and had so much fun with it. So this one I am definitely keeping. I am also keeping Empowered, which I've used a few times and really enjoy, and Naughty as well. But I didn't ever really love the Mercury Retrograde. I think it's just too light for me. There's just not enough depth for me overall, and I don't love the shimmers on this either. I hardly touch this one. This was a palette that I decluttered once and actually repurchased again, because once I fell in love with these, I was like, wait, maybe I didn't give Mercury Retrograde a shot, and I repurchased it and realized, no, I just really don't like that color story. And then this is the Jaguar palette. Although I really love this color story, some of the shadows are a little too thin and unimpressive, like some of the topper shadows. So even though it's cool and I like the color story, I can create this color story using some other palettes. So I'm gonna let these go. I have two Pat McGrath palettes. I am going to be keeping one and decluttering another. This was a palette I actually purchased twice. I have never really loved the Pat McGrath formula. This is a Mothership Bronze Seduction, I believe. And this is the one I'm actually decluttering. Although very pretty, I've never really been the biggest fan of the formula. And I mean, the packaging is just so inconvenient. So I don't want to keep this because it just doesn't make me happy. There are other formulas I like better. So I hardly use this one. In fact, I had buyer's remorse, contacted Pat McGrath, and they never wrote me back. So I got stuck with the palette. This one, on the other hand, I have used a few times. This is the Mothership 6, I believe. And this one I have used a few times. Again, not that impressed with the formula, though I have had a nice time using it. So every single look I've created out of this, I have kicked myself and said, wow, that actually looks really pretty. So for whatever reason, I think this one works for me better. I really love the color story of the Urban Decay Wild West, but I did not like the performance of it, so I'm definitely gonna let this one go. I like the performance of this Foxy mini palette, but I have this in other formulations that I prefer the same type of color story, so I'm gonna let this one go too, though I did like the formula here. These by Tammy Tenuka are so gorgeous. These are mini palettes in Chinchilla as well as Peacock. They are extraordinary. I wish we can still purchase from them, but they are a Russian brand and we are not allowed to. In the United States, it's been blocked. And the Stila Camouflage palette, this is one of my favorites. This was like a favorite 2 years ago. It still is wonderful. Some of the best shadows and easiest eye looks I've created, so love that one. This one by Laura Geller I was excited for because it kind of reminded me of the Anastasia Nouveau palette, but the formula is just a little thin, ho-hum, non-impressive. This is by Lisa Eldridge. This is the Sorcery palette. Very, very pretty, more of a topper kind of palette, so I keep this in my drawer with toppers. I do not think it's worth the price point per se, but it is very nice. I just, I think you can find better formulas out there at, you know, a fraction of the cost. So I recently embarked on an expensive habit of collecting Viseart eyeshadow palettes. Actually, I did not love Viseart's formula. especially with some of the older palettes. I just found like I couldn't blend them properly, and I just was very frustrated by the formula. But some of the newer palettes that I have encountered have, I don't know, maybe my skills have gotten better, or I just know myself better and I know to go lighter handed and kind of build up. I just have really fallen in love with the formula. Slim size of the Sultry Muse. This is the full size palette. I'm gonna let this one go because I have the travel size of it. We'll be keeping all of these. So probably the first one that I really fell in love with was the Violet Attendu. This one here. I try to keep these little covers because it just protects the shadows more. Another one I recently played around with and just loved was the Soleil La Plage. This one here. The Murray is for kind of moody and fall-like. And then for the larger size, I have Bijoux. This is the only other one. This is probably my least favorite in that I have to just be more careful with this one and figuring out what I'm doing, but it's still a great formula. And here we have some that are for the cities. We have the San Francisco Etoile, this one here. This is sort of a mini version of that Naked Wild West palette, but just done in a better formula. And then this is the Paris Etoile. This was again one of my first into this new formulation, smaller format, and I really love the moody looks here. So comparing the Huda Jaguar palette to this, I much prefer this, and I get a lot of the same looks with this palette. And then here we have some basic palettes, which I would consider the matte neutral, really just more utilitarian, but can help build out any look. Same thing with these Petite Matte Cool palette, though it has a little more vividness. My latest acquisition was Koi. This is an all shimmer palette, so really like some of these shimmers. Here is the Dark Edit, which is one that I wanted for a really long time. I haven't played around with this one as much, but it's very pretty. Here we have the Paris Edit. I feel like this is just so soft and feminine. And then this is the Sultry Muse palette, which is the mini of that one that I already have, which I know everyone's gonna be like, why don't you peel the plastic? I always forget to peel the plastic because I don't ever use the mirrors and these palettes to actually do my makeup. Color shifter palettes were all really good. I did a dedicated video to them. It's just in my collection. I'm going to probably go for a Colourpop palette or one of those Visearts before I would go to these, but I do recommend these if you're looking for affordable, good palettes. This one is the brown tone one, and this one was excellent. So highly recommend this one. I also really loved the green one. If you're into kind of grungy tones, this one was really, really good. And probably my other favorite was this one. This black is really great to build out a look, and so if you're a warm tone person, I think you'd really enjoy that. My least favorite was this purpley one, but all were good. I mean, there were none that were real duds. I was very impressed. I really don't like the Sephora Destinations palette, but these color shifter palettes were really, really good. So I'm gonna part with all of them, but it's just because the size of my collection, I don't need them in my life, but they are all really, really fantastic quality. Here are palettes that I haven't really yet been able to play around with, but I'm hoping to. These are all by Fantasy Cosmetica. I fell in love with this formula, but I haven't played around with it enough, but I bought all the palettes because I loved it that much. These shimmers are extraordinary, really, really extraordinary, and this is part of the reason why the Glaminatrix Nocturnal palette got kicked out, because I like this formula better. It's really vivid, colorful, yet wearable. This is Sorcerer. That first one was Bard. This was my first and favorite one, Druid. Look at that, just so beautiful. And this one is a recent acquisition. This is the Rogue palette. These palettes are fairly pricey, but they are indie, and I feel like they're special, and the quality is really great. So I do not begrudge supporting an indie brand that is putting out as high quality as these are. Last but not least, we have Lorac. So this is one of those brands where I am always immensely impressed with the quality and the looks I get. That being said, I am gonna part with a couple of them just because either the color stories don't inspire me or it's just time to let it go. So of these minis, I love all three of these. And in fact, these were some of the reasons why I was okay parting with some of those neutral palettes of Natasha Denona's, the minis, because I prefer the formulation here. And these are so small and so convenient to travel with that I will easily take these along for a trip. So this is Mystic Oak, Frosted Sequoia, and Winter Rose. This one I've had for a while. This is a warm neutral palette. This is a little mini that I got. I'm gonna declutter this one. It's been some time that I've had this and it doesn't have as much variety of depth that I need. I'm also parting with the Lorac Pro, the original. I love this. I love this color story. I still love the formulation, but when I compared it to the new Soleil palette, I found that the shadows are even creamier and the foiled shades are even more foiled. This is more warm tone leaning and this is like neutral. And I am more going to use something that is probably warm tone leaning or some of those other minis. I also have the Noir palette, but I was not as impressed with this one and its layout. I wish it had more mattes to it. It just has 2 rows of shimmer and a row of mattes. I just find a lot of the shimmers are duplicative. So I'm gonna let go of the Noir and the original Pro and keep the Soleil. These are the final tallies. I started off with 152 palettes. I am actually going to keep 73 of those and I'm decluttering 79. That is more than half and I'm very, very happy with that. I feel like this is a good start. I hope that you enjoyed that, got inspired to look at your own collection, and we'll talk soon. Take care, everyone. Bye.